The quiet suburban neighborhood buzzed with its usual morning routine. People jogged along the manicured sidewalks, luxury cars hummed out of driveways, and gardeners tended to immaculate lawns. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone noticed everything, and yet no one truly paid attention. Today, however, something was different. A man sat hunched on the sidewalk just outside the gates of the grandest mansion on the block. His clothes were tattered, his hair unkempt, and a cardboard sign rested against his knees with the words, "Lost everything. Need help." At first glance, he appeared to be just another homeless man who had wandered into the wrong part of town, but those who passed by him quickly found his presence unsettling. This wasn't the kind of place where you expected to see poverty, and his proximity to the towering estate behind him made the scene even more jarring. Some people whispered in hushed tones, others crossed the street to avoid him, and a few shot disapproving looks, as if his very existence was an affront to their well-manicured lives. Inside the mansion, a tall figure watched from an upstairs window. Daniel Rivers stood silently, his sharp gaze fixed on the scene unfolding below. In his mid-50s, Daniel was a man who exuded quiet authority. His tailored suits and polished demeanor spoke of immense wealth and success, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, a growing cynicism, a sense of detachment from the very world he had worked so hard to build. Over the years, Daniel had amassed an empire. From tech innovations to luxury real estate, his businesses had made him one of the wealthiest men in the region. But with wealth came isolation, and with isolation came doubts about the people surrounding him. He had seen it all: friends who turned into opportunists, family members who treated him as an endless source of financial support, employees who smiled to his face but schemed behind his back. Lately, Daniel had begun to question whether anyone in his life cared for him beyond his bank account. The thought gnawed at him, keeping him awake at night. Then, a few weeks ago, an overheard conversation among his household staff had planted the seed of an idea in his mind, a radical, almost reckless idea. One morning, as Daniel passed through the kitchen, he heard laughter coming from a group of maids and gardeners. At first, their chatter seemed harmless, but as he lingered unseen, their words hit him like a punch to the gut. "I mean, really, who needs that much money?" One of them said, a note of contempt in her voice. "He could probably buy a new car every day and still have change to spare." "Yeah," another chimed in. "And have you ever noticed? He barely talks to anyone. It's like he's too good for us." Daniel had walked away without confronting them, but the words stuck with him. Were they right? Had his success made him distant, or were people just unwilling to see beyond his wealth? He decided he needed to find out, not just about his staff, but about everyone in his orbit. How did they truly perceive him? And what would they do if they thought he had nothing left to give? And so, today, Daniel sat outside his own gates, cloaked in anonymity. His disguise was perfect. Gone were the sleek suits and polished shoes. In their place were second-hand clothes he had bought from a thrift store on the other side of town. His normally pristine hair was deliberately disheveled, and his face bore smudges of dirt carefully applied to enhance the illusion. Even his posture was different, slouched and defeated, a far cry from the confident stance he usually carried. The first few hours passed uneventfully. Most people hurried by, barely sparing him a glance. A few joggers looked at him with a mix of curiosity and disdain, but none stopped to offer a word or a coin. Daniel's heart sank as he realized how invisible he had become. This was a man who, just days ago, couldn't step into a restaurant without being greeted with smiles and deference. Now, sitting here as a beggar, he felt like a ghost. Late in the morning, a young woman in a business suit approached the gates. Daniel recognized her immediately. It was Sarah, his assistant, someone he trusted to manage critical aspects of his schedule and communications. She walked briskly, her eyes scanning her phone, but when she came close enough to notice him, she stopped abruptly. For a moment, their eyes met, and Daniel held his breath, wondering if she would recognize him through the disguise. "Excuse me," she said, her tone curt. "You can't sit here. This is private property." Daniel said nothing, lowering his gaze to avoid her scrutiny. He mumbled a vague apology, and after a few seconds of hesitation, Sarah shook her head and walked through the gates. Daniel felt a pang of disappointment. Sarah had always been polite and professional, but her reaction confirmed something he had long suspected. Her loyalty lay with her paycheck, not with him. As the day wore on, Daniel encountered a mix of reactions. A delivery driver paused to offer him a bottle of water, while a group of teenagers on skateboards jeered at him, tossing a crumpled fast food wrapper in his direction. One neighbor, a middle-aged man named George whom Daniel had exchanged pleasantries with on countless occasions, walked by without even acknowledging him. Just when Daniel began to think the entire experiment was a mistake, something unexpected happened. A small girl, no older than 6, approached him with hesitant steps. She clutched a dollar bill in her tiny hand, her eyes wide with curiosity and concern. "Are you hungry?" she asked softly, holding out the dollar. Her mother, who had been chatting with a friend nearby, noticed and rushed over, pulling the girl away. "Don't talk to strangers," the mother scolded, casting a wary glance at Daniel. "You don't know where he's been." "But, Mommy, he looks sad," the girl protested. The mother shook her head and led her daughter away, but not before the little girl managed to drop the dollar at Daniel's feet. For the first time that day, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. The child's simple act of kindness reminded him that not everyone was jaded by appearances. As dusk began to settle, Daniel finally rose to his feet, his legs stiff from sitting on the cold pavement all day. He had seen enough for now, but this was only the beginning. The experiment had already revealed more than he expected, and he knew it was far from over. Tomorrow, he would take his disguise to another part of his life, to his businesses, his social circles, and the very people who claimed to care about him. He was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. As Daniel walked back toward the mansion's side entrance, he glanced over his shoulder at the empty street. He felt a strange mix of emotions, sadness, anger, but also a newfound resolve. He wasn't just testing others, he was testing himself. Could he face the truths he uncovered? And more importantly, could he change the narrative of his own life before it was too late? Only time would tell. The night was restless for Daniel Rivers. After his first day disguised as a beggar, the weight of the reactions he had witnessed clung to him like a heavy fog. He sat in the dimly lit study of his mansion, a room filled with leather-bound books and priceless artifacts, but all of it felt hollow tonight. The experiment he had embarked on was no longer just about testing others. It was beginning to reveal truths about himself that he wasn't sure he was ready to face. As dawn broke, Daniel prepared for the second phase of his plan. The day before, he had tested the reactions of his immediate surroundings, his neighbors, his staff, and a few strangers. Today, he would venture deeper into his world, into the heart of his empire. He would test the people who relied on his wealth for their livelihoods, the ones who wore masks of loyalty and gratitude. If yesterday's experiences had shaken him, he wondered how much more unsettling this phase would be. Daniel left the house before sunrise, dressed once again in his carefully crafted disguise. He took an old bicycle, something he hadn't ridden in decades, and pedaled to one of his office buildings several miles away. The ride was grueling, the cold morning air biting at his skin, but he welcomed the discomfort. It grounded him, reminding him of the stark difference between the man he was portraying and the man he had become. The building was a modern architectural masterpiece, with sleek glass walls and a towering facade that seemed to scrape the clouds. As Daniel approached, he saw employees streaming in, clutching coffee cups and chatting in small groups. None of them paid him any attention as he parked his bike a short distance away and settled into his new role. He positioned himself near the main entrance, his hand outstretched and his gaze downcast, just another figure lost in the crowd. For the first hour, the responses mirrored what he had seen the day before. People ignored him, sidestepped him, or looked at him with mild irritation. Then something unexpected happened. A young woman named Lisa, one of his junior staff members, stopped and crouched down beside him. Lisa was known for her diligent work ethic and her cheerful demeanor, though Daniel had never interacted with her directly. "Hey," she said softly. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Daniel mumbled a rehearsed response about losing his job and being unable to afford rent. Lisa's expression softened, and she rummaged through her purse, pulling out a few crumpled bills. "It's not much," she said, "but I hope it helps." Her kindness caught Daniel off guard. For a moment, he considered ending the act and thanking her, but he held back. This wasn't just about her. It was about uncovering the broader truth. He thanked her quietly, and she smiled before heading inside. The rest of the day unfolded with mixed results. Several employees, including some high-ranking executives, walked past him without so much as a glance. One man, a senior manager named Greg, muttered under his breath, "Another vagrant in the wrong place," loud enough for Daniel to hear. The comment stung, especially because Greg had always been vocal in praising Daniel during company meetings. It was a reminder of how easily people's true feelings could be concealed behind a veneer of professionalism. Around lunchtime, Daniel decided to take his experiment to another level. He moved to the parking garage, where he knew he could observe employees in a more informal setting. He stationed himself near the entrance, leaning against a wall and feigning exhaustion. It didn't take long for an opportunity to arise. A group of employees, including Greg and Lisa, exited the building together, laughing and chatting. As they approached, Daniel deliberately stumbled, drawing their attention. Lisa was the first to react, rushing to his side and asking if he was okay. Greg, on the other hand, rolled his eyes and muttered, "These people always make a scene." Daniel noted the stark contrast between the two. Lisa's concern was genuine, while Greg's disdain was palpable. It was a moment of clarity for Daniel, reinforcing his belief that true character revealed itself in unguarded moments. Later that afternoon, Daniel returned to the front of the building, feeling a growing sense of unease. His disguise had allowed him to see his employees in a way he never could as their boss, but the truths he uncovered were far from comforting. For every Lisa, there seemed to be a Greg, people who saw him as nothing more than a resource to exploit or a problem to dismiss. As the day drew to a close, Daniel encountered one final test of humanity. A man in a janitor's uniform approached him, carrying a sandwich and a bottle of water. "I don't have much," the janitor said, "but you look like you could use this more than me." Daniel accepted the offering with a grateful nod, his heart heavy with a mix of gratitude and guilt. The janitor, a man whose name he didn't even know, had shown more compassion than many of the executives who earned six-figure salaries under his leadership. When the office building emptied for the day, Daniel quietly slipped away, his mind racing with everything he had witnessed. He pedaled home in the fading light, the weight of the day pressing down on him. The kindness of people like Lisa and the janitor had given him hope, but the indifference and cruelty of others had left him deeply unsettled. As he arrived back at the mansion, Daniel parked the bicycle and entered through a side door, careful to avoid his staff. He made his way to the study and collapsed into a chair, his thoughts swirling. The experiment was far from over, but the lessons he had learned so far were already reshaping his understanding of the world and his place in it. Tomorrow, he would take his disguise to the next level, venturing into the social circles where appearances mattered most. But for now, he sat alone in the silence of his grand home, a man grappling with the uncomfortable truths about the people around him and himself. The morning came with an eerie stillness, as though the world itself was holding its breath for what Daniel Rivers would uncover next. He woke early, his mind already churning with thoughts of the previous day. The kindness of Lisa and the janitor had been a balm to his growing cynicism, but the dismissive attitudes of others had reinforced his doubts about humanity. Today, Daniel planned to test the waters of his social circle, the elite group of acquaintances and so-called friends who populated the upper echelons of society. If his disguise could fool his neighbors and employees, it would surely be the ultimate test among those who prided themselves on their ability to read people. Daniel donned his disguise with meticulous care. Every detail mattered. He smeared dirt onto his face and hands, ensuring they looked convincingly grimy. His clothes, deliberately wrinkled and worn, carried the faint odor of sweat and neglect. The finishing touch was a pair of scuffed shoes, the soles worn thin from imaginary miles. When he looked in the mirror, he hardly recognized himself. He wasn't Daniel Rivers, the billionaire philanthropist and tech mogul. He was a nameless, faceless figure on the margins of society. He set off toward the city center, where many of his wealthy friends frequented exclusive cafes, private clubs, and boutique stores. His first destination was a trendy coffee shop where he knew several of his acquaintances often held impromptu meetings. Daniel positioned himself near the entrance, clutching a small sign that read, "Hungry. Please help." He chose his spot carefully, ensuring he would be directly in the line of sight of anyone entering or exiting the cafe. It didn't take long for familiar faces to appear. The first was Marcia, a socialite who often attended the charity galas Daniel hosted. She was dressed impeccably in a designer coat, her heels clicking sharply on the pavement as she approached the cafe. Daniel lowered his gaze as she walked past, but not before catching her reaction. Her lips curled in disdain, and she muttered something under her breath. He couldn't hear her exact words, but her expression spoke volumes. She didn't recognize him. She didn't even see him as a person. A few minutes later, another familiar face emerged. Richard, a fellow entrepreneur and someone Daniel had once considered a close friend, strolled toward the cafe with a group of colleagues. Daniel braced himself, wondering if Richard would show any sign of recognition. To his surprise, Richard stopped in front of him, pulling out his wallet. "Here," Richard said, handing him a crisp $20 bill. "Get yourself something to eat." Daniel mumbled a thank you, his heart conflictingly heavy and light. Richard's gesture was kind, but it was also impersonal. There was no recognition, no curiosity about who he was or how he had ended up here. To Richard, he was just another nameless beggar, a problem to be momentarily solved with money. The day continued in much the same way. Daniel encountered several more acquaintances, all of whom failed to recognize him. Most ignored him entirely, their eyes sliding over him as though he were invisible. A few offered small amounts of money or food, but their interactions were perfunctory at best. By the time the sun began to set, Daniel felt a deep weariness settle over him, not just physical exhaustion, but an emotional heaviness he couldn't shake. As he prepared to leave the cafe area, a voice called out to him, "Hey, you, wait a second." Daniel turned to see an older man approaching, someone he didn't recognize. The man was dressed modestly, his clothes clean but not expensive, and he carried a bag from a local grocery store. He reached into the bag and pulled out a sandwich, handing it to Daniel. "I don't have much," the man said, his voice kind, "but everyone deserves a meal." For the second time that day, Daniel felt a glimmer of hope. This man, a complete stranger, had shown more compassion than many of the people Daniel considered friends. It was a sobering realization, one that left him questioning the value of his carefully curated social circle. As night fell, Daniel decided to take his experiment one step further. He ventured to an exclusive rooftop event hosted by one of his oldest acquaintances, a hedge fund manager named Victor. The event was invite-only, and Daniel had received an invitation weeks ago, but tonight he would attend in disguise, blending in as one of the waitstaff. He had made arrangements with the catering company in advance, offering to volunteer for the night under a pseudonym. Dressed in a crisp white shirt and black trousers provided by the caterers, Daniel slipped into the event unnoticed. The rooftop was a stunning display of opulence, with string lights casting a warm glow over the elegantly dressed guests. Laughter and the clinking of glasses filled the air as servers moved discreetly among the crowd, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Daniel moved among the guests, carefully observing their interactions. Many of the people here had been to his home, sat at his table, and toasted to his successes. Yet none of them spared him more than a passing glance. To them, he was just another faceless worker, a background figure in their glamorous lives. As the evening wore on, Daniel found himself near a conversation between Victor and a small group of guests. They were discussing business, politics, and to Daniel's dismay, him. "Have you seen Daniel lately?" one of the women asked. "He's been so reclusive." Victor chuckled, swirling his glass of wine. "Probably holed up in that mansion of his. You know how these billionaires get. They lose touch with reality." The others laughed, and Daniel felt a pang of anger and sadness. These were people he had supported, people who had benefited from his generosity. Yet here they were, mocking him behind his back. Toward the end of the night, as the crowd began to thin, Daniel decided to confront Victor. He approached him near the bar, still in his server uniform, and said, "Excuse me, sir, could I ask you something?" Victor turned, clearly irritated. "What is it? Can't you see I'm busy?" "If you knew someone who had lost everything, would you help them?" Daniel asked, his voice steady. Victor scoffed. "That depends. Some people bring it on themselves. You can't save everyone." Daniel nodded, his expression unreadable. "I see. Thank you for your honesty." As he walked away, Daniel felt a strange sense of closure. The experiment had revealed more than he had anticipated, not just about others, but about himself. He had spent years building relationships based on wealth and status, but the events of the past 2 days had shown him the fragility of those connections. The people who truly mattered were the ones who saw beyond the surface, who treated others with kindness and respect, regardless of their circumstances. When Daniel returned home that night, he sat in his study and reflected on everything he had experienced. The experiment wasn't over, but he already knew it had changed him. Tomorrow, he would face his family, the final test of his journey. But tonight, he allowed himself a moment of quiet resolve, knowing that he was beginning to understand what truly mattered. The morning sunlight filtered through the large windows of Daniel Rivers' mansion, casting long, golden beams across the polished marble floors. For the first time in years, Daniel found himself unsure of what the day would bring. His carefully constructed experiment had already exposed cracks in the world he had built, a world of wealth, power, and influence. He had tested his neighbors, his employees, and his social circle, uncovering both glimmers of humanity and depths of selfishness. But today, he was venturing into the most personal and potentially painful territory, his own family. Daniel's relationship with his family had always been complicated. As the eldest son of a modest middle-class family, he had carried the weight of expectations from an early age. His siblings, younger by several years, had grown up in the shadow of his success. Over time, the closeness they had once shared as children gave way to distance, misunderstandings, and unspoken resentments. Money had only widened the gap. Some family members saw him as a provider, others as a symbol of their own inadequacies, and a few as an endless resource to be tapped. Daniel often wondered if any of them truly saw him as a person. Today, Daniel would find out. Dressed in his now familiar disguise, he left the mansion early and headed to the modest suburban home of his younger brother, Mark. Mark was a school teacher with a growing family, and while he and Daniel had remained cordial over the years, their conversations rarely went beyond surface-level pleasantries. Mark had often refused financial help from Daniel, citing his desire to be self-sufficient. On the surface, it seemed admirable, but Daniel couldn't help but sense an undercurrent of pride and bitterness in his brother's demeanor. Daniel positioned himself on the sidewalk near Mark's home, sitting on an old blanket with a small cardboard sign that read, "Struggling. Any help appreciated." He chose this spot carefully, knowing that Mark's morning routine would bring him past this area. The quiet residential street began to stir with activity as neighbors left for work and children played in front yards. Daniel kept his head low, his heart pounding as he waited for his brother to appear. It didn't take long. Mark emerged from his house, dressed in a button-up shirt and slacks, his briefcase in hand. He was accompanied by his wife, Claire, who was carrying their youngest child, a toddler with curly hair and wide, curious eyes. As they walked toward their car, Mark's gaze fell on Daniel. He slowed his pace, frowning slightly, while Claire seemed to hesitate. "Mark," Claire said softly, glancing at the man sitting on the sidewalk. "Should we?" Mark shook his head, his expression unreadable. "We don't have time for this. He's probably just another scammer." Daniel's chest tightened at the words, but he forced himself to remain still. Claire looked conflicted, her steps faltering as she glanced back at Daniel. "But what if he's not? Look at him, Mark. He looks like he hasn't eaten in days." Mark sighed heavily, his voice tinged with frustration. "Claire, we have bills to pay. We can't save everyone. Let's go." Claire hesitated for another moment before following Mark to the car. As they drove away, Daniel felt a mix of disappointment and understanding. Mark's reaction wasn't entirely unexpected. His brother had always been pragmatic to a fault. But Claire's lingering concern offered a small measure of comfort. She had seen him, even if only briefly. Daniel stayed in the area for a while longer, observing the rhythms of the neighborhood. Several neighbors walked past him, offering nothing more than a fleeting glance. A young boy on a bicycle stopped to stare, his wide eyes full of curiosity, but his mother quickly ushered him away, muttering about strangers. It was a sobering reminder of how easily people dismissed those who didn't fit into their neatly ordered lives. Later that afternoon, Daniel decided to visit his sister, Emily. Unlike Mark, Emily had never shied away from asking for help. Over the years, Daniel had provided her with financial support on numerous occasions, from paying off her student loans to helping her start a small bakery. Emily always expressed gratitude, but Daniel often wondered if her reliance on him had eroded her sense of independence or their bond as siblings. Emily's bakery was located in a bustling downtown area, a cozy shop with pastel-colored walls and the sweet aroma of freshly baked goods wafting through the air. Daniel sat up near the entrance, his sign propped against his knees as he waited for her to notice him. The bakery was busy, with a steady stream of customers coming and going. Daniel watched as Emily moved behind the counter, her movements quick and efficient as she greeted customers with a warm smile. After about an hour, Emily stepped outside to take a short break. She lit a cigarette and leaned against the wall, her eyes scanning the street. When her gaze landed on Daniel, she froze. For a moment, he thought she might recognize him, but her expression quickly shifted to one of guarded concern. "Hey," she called out, approaching him cautiously. "Are you okay? You look like you've had a rough time." Daniel nodded slightly, keeping his answers vague. "Just trying to get by," he said. "It's been hard." Emily studied him for a moment before reaching into her pocket and pulling out a few crumpled bills. "Here," she said, handing them to him. "It's not much, but it's all I've got right now." "Thank you," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. He wanted to say more, to tell her who he was and how much her gesture meant, but he held back. This wasn't the time. Emily hesitated, as though she wanted to say something else, but a customer called her name from inside the bakery, breaking the moment. She offered him a small apologetic smile before hurrying back inside. As Daniel watched her go, he felt a deep ache in his chest. Emily's kindness was genuine, but it also carried an undercurrent of guilt. He wondered if she had given him money out of compassion or out of a sense of obligation, an unspoken repayment for all the times he had helped her in the past. By the end of the day, Daniel returned home feeling drained. The encounters with his siblings had left him with more questions than answers. Determined to understand more, Daniel followed them from a distance, careful not to be seen. They returned to their house, a modest single-story home with a small garden Ruth tended to religiously. He waited until evening before making his next move. Under the cover of dusk, he approached the house and knocked on the door. Ruth answered, her expression cautious but kind. "Can I help you?" Daniel hesitated, then took a deep breath. "It's me, Mom." For a moment, Ruth stared at him, her eyes widening in shock. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Is that really you?" "It's me," he said, pulling off his cap and letting the light reveal his face. Ruth's hands flew to her mouth, and tears welled in her eyes. "George, it's Daniel," she called over her shoulder. Moments later, George appeared, his face a mixture of disbelief and confusion. "What the hell is going on?" George demanded, his tone sharp. "Why are you dressed like that?" Daniel stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice steady. "There's something I've been trying to figure out, and I needed to see how people would treat me if they didn't know who I was." "What are you talking about?" George asked, his brow furrowed. "You've been pretending to be homeless." "Yes," Daniel admitted. "I needed to know if people cared about me for who I am, not for what I have." Ruth sank into a chair, her hands trembling. "Daniel, why would you do something like this? Don't you know how dangerous that could be?" "I had to," he said. "I spent so many years surrounded by people who only see the money, the success. I needed to know the truth." "And what did you find?" George asked, his tone still edged with disbelief. Daniel hesitated, then said, "I found that the people who matter the most are the ones who see beyond appearances, the ones who show kindness, even when they have nothing to gain." Ruth reached for his hand, her eyes filled with tears. "Daniel, you didn't need to do all this to know that we love you." "I know," he said softly, "but I've been so caught up in my own world that I forgot what love looks like. I forgot what it means to trust people." George sighed heavily, sitting down beside Ruth. "You've always been too hard on yourself, son. But this is extreme. You can't measure people's worth based on one encounter." "Maybe not," Daniel admitted, "but I needed to see for myself. And what I saw, it's changed me." They talked late into the night, their conversation weaving through years of unspoken feelings and unresolved tensions. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt truly connected to his parents, not as the billionaire son or the prodigal child, but as a human being trying to make sense of the world. As he left their house that night, Daniel felt a profound sense of clarity. The experiment had been painful, even unsettling, but it had also been necessary. It had shown him the best and worst of humanity, and it had reminded him of what truly mattered. For the first time in years, he felt ready to move forward, not as the man the world expected him to be, but as the man he wanted to become. The days following Daniel Rivers' confrontation with his parents were quiet but transformative. The experiment, which had started as a way to understand the people around him, had evolved into something much deeper, a reckoning with himself. He had spent years living in a fortress of wealth and influence, but his journey as a beggar had stripped away the illusions he had built and forced him to confront the raw truths of human nature and his own role in creating the barriers between himself and others. This morning, Daniel stood in the center of his opulent living room, the vast space suddenly feeling more like a cavern than a home. The marble floors gleamed under the sunlight, streaming through the massive windows, and the carefully curated art pieces on the walls seemed to mock him. For the first time, he saw this place not as a sanctuary, but as a gilded cage that had isolated him from the world. Today, he would bring the experiment to an end, but not without making the changes it had inspired. Daniel dressed in simple, casual clothes, nothing like the extravagant suits he had once worn daily, and called for a meeting of his closest staff and associates. He wanted them all to hear what he had to say, from the household staff, who kept his estate running, to the executives who managed his businesses. When everyone had gathered in the grand hall, their murmurs filled the space as they exchanged curious glances. Daniel stood at the front, his expression serious but calm. He raised a hand, and the room fell silent. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice steady but uncharacteristically warm. Over the past week, I've undertaken a personal experiment, something I haven't shared with anyone until now. I disguised myself as someone with nothing. No money, no home, no status. I wanted to see how the world treats people who are invisible, and I wanted to understand how I've been treated by those around me. Not as Daniel Rivers, but as just another human being. The room erupted into murmurs of surprise and confusion, but Daniel held up his hand again to quiet them. I saw many things, he continued. I saw indifference, kindness, cruelty, and compassion. I saw people who offered help when they had nothing to gain, and others who looked away because they didn't want to see. But most importantly, I saw myself in all of it. I realized how much I've allowed my wealth and success to shield me from the reality of others' struggles, and how I've let it affect my relationships. He paused, scanning the faces in the room. Some looked intrigued, others uneasy. Lisa, the junior staff member who had shown him kindness during his experiment, stood near the back, her expression a mix of curiosity and pride. I owe many of you an apology, Daniel said. I've been distant, focused on building an empire instead of fostering connections. I've treated some of you as resources instead of people, and for that, I'm deeply sorry. The room was silent now, the weight of his words sinking in. Daniel took a deep breath and continued. But this isn't just about an apology. It's about action. Starting today, things will change. For my household staff, I'm implementing programs to ensure you have access to education, career growth, and financial security beyond this job. For my company, we'll be revisiting how we treat our employees at every level, because no one should feel invisible in the workplace. He turned his gaze to Lisa, who looked stunned to be singled out. And to those who showed kindness, like Lisa, I want you to know that your actions didn't go unnoticed. People like you remind me that humanity still exists, even in the darkest places. As the staff began to absorb his words, Daniel shifted his focus to the broader community. Over the past week, he had been profoundly affected by the plight of those who lived on the fringes of society. The people who had ignored him weren't just his neighbors or acquaintances. They were a reflection of a larger system that dehumanized the vulnerable. Daniel knew he had to use his influence to make a difference. He announced the launch of a foundation dedicated to addressing homelessness and poverty, starting in his own city. The foundation would fund shelters, job training programs, mental health services, and other initiatives aimed at giving people the tools they needed to rebuild their lives. This isn't just about charity, Daniel explained. It's about empowerment. It's about creating a world where everyone has a chance to be seen and heard. The announcement was met with a wave of applause, but Daniel wasn't finished. He stepped forward, his voice growing more personal. But change doesn't just happen through big gestures, he said. It happens in the everyday moments, in the way we treat the people around us. I've learned that kindness costs nothing, but it has the power to change everything. So I ask each of you, how will you choose to see the world? Will you look away, or will you look closer? His final words hung in the air, a challenge that resonated deeply with everyone in the room. As the meeting ended and the staff began to disperse, many stayed behind to thank him or share their own stories of struggle and perseverance. Lisa approached him, her eyes shining with gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly, "for seeing us." Daniel nodded, his chest tight with emotion. "Thank you for reminding me how to." That evening, Daniel sat alone in his study, reflecting on the week's events. The journey had been painful and humbling, but it had also been transformative. He had seen the best and worst of humanity, and in doing so, he had rediscovered himself. He wasn't just a billionaire or a businessman. He was a man who could choose to make a difference. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over the city, Daniel penned the final words of a letter he planned to share publicly, detailing his experience and the lessons he had learned. He ended the letter with a question he hoped would spark conversations far beyond his circle. If you passed someone who seemed invisible today, would you stop to see them? And if not, why? He folded the letter and set it aside, his heart lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in a long time, Daniel felt not just wealthy, but rich in purpose, in connection, and in the hope that change, no matter how small, was always possible.